Good morning, Facebook. Is it morning still? It's morning, 10:30. So, I'm really anxious this morning. Might have had too much coffee though, that happens. I've had a question emailed to me, and the question is around how to practice being more flexible when we have a child who experiences incredible inflexibility when we're very inflexible ourselves. Hi, Carrie. Lovely to see you. So, I'm going to talk about this because I know exactly how this feels. Being an adult myself with a PDA profile of autism, parenting 4 autistic children, being married to an autistic husband, and how many are in our family? 6. 5 out of 6 of us have a PDA profile. So you can imagine how that might play out in a family when we have no awareness of PDA, not heard of it, don't know what it is, and that was our life for a number of years. When I reflect on my own parenting before I learnt about my PDA, and you don't have to have a PDA profile of autism to be inflexible. And I don't even like to say that, to be inflexible, because nothing is permanent. The beginning for us as adults is that, hi Fiona, most of us were raised by a generation who parented in a very conventional way where children were guided, they were told how to do life and not really encouraged to have opinions or to answer back. I mean, it was called answering back if we tried to enter into discussion or anything like that. And I see a lot of that still now. I don't think that anybody's necessarily to blame for that. That's just society, and we evolve and things change. But what that means for people around my age is that we've grown up with this model of what parenting should look like, and we've been heavily conditioned to do it that way. Now, if you add an autistic diagnosis on top of that, or if you identify as autistic, then yes, Nola, exactly, seen and not heard, thank you. If you're autistic as well, like myself, that means that we take these rules and structures and social conventions and cultural conditions, and they become this intrinsic part of our values and our goals and how we believe we should be parenting. And it's very, very difficult to undo that, even for people without a diagnosis of autism. So then when you take somebody like me, a PDA, I parented from a very controlling space, very, very controlling. And, it got ugly. It got really ugly. So, like I said, I have 4 children. The eldest will be 22 this year. She ended up leaving our family home at 16 because of my rigidity and my inflexibility. It was almost pathological, my need to control. And a lot of my need to control my children was out of a space of fear as well, because many of us as adults, and again, particularly when we're autistic, many of us have these incredible backstories that involve a lot of trauma and hardship and being misunderstood. And so when we are raising our own children, there's this subconscious force within us that we don't want their lives to be as difficult for them as ours were for us. And for me, that wasn't even really something that I was conscious of. I just parented in a way that I felt was both guiding my children and protecting them. But I was suffocating them. I was stuffing stifling their freedom and their creativity and their self-expression. I'd hone in on what they were wearing and I'd tell them, you know, I don't think that's appropriate. And, you know, within reason, those things are okay, but I was over the top. So we had a very painful family experience. We were very disconnected. And then it wasn't until a little bit later that I learnt about PDA, and I learnt about my parenting. I got to the space where I knew I was controlling, but I just found it so hard to be any other way. It was so difficult. How do you take this way of being that you've been your entire life and then change it? Well, it doesn't happen overnight. It really doesn't. And usually, you know, it takes a lot of pain, or it takes some form of crisis for many people to get to a space where they hit rock bottom and they go, okay, you know, it can't get worse than this. And then we really have a good look at how things are. And when my now 5-year-old was born, thank God, thank the universe, thank whatever, fortunately, she was born with a very assertive nature, very free-spirited, very free-willed, does not back down for anybody. Now, to begin with, that was extremely confronting, extremely painful, and it was very challenging for me. But eventually I came to the space where I realised, okay, we've had enough of this pain in our family. We've had enough of butting heads. It's enough. I can continue to argue and get into these ongoing battles with my children, and, you know, be uptight and have a lot of tension in the house all the time, or I can try another way. And it was not easy. It was really, really hard. So, you know, I knew that my children didn't like me looking over their shoulder when they were doing homework. And because I had a teaching background, I was very academically driven and I wanted my children to achieve. So I was quite pedantic and panicked about that. But I just took one thing at a time and I just started to back off. And I had to sit with that incredibly, this gross discomfort. You know, what if they fail at school? What if they're not doing their homework? And you know what? They weren't doing their homework because they're PDAs and it was difficult for them to get homework done. So I also had to sit with the discomfort of knowing that there was a possibility that some things in my children's lives would fall apart, would untangle, would unravel, things wouldn't get completed, and I had to come to a space where I was willing to trust the process and be okay with that. And, you know, the evidence was that my relationships with my children began to change. They started actually coming out of their rooms and wanting to spend time with their parents because we weren't constantly on them about things. And if you have a child with a PDA profile, you don't need to be on them about everything. Just being on them at all sometimes about brushing teeth or getting pajamas on or, you know, eating breakfast, those things can actually push our children into their room where they'll shut the door and not come out. You know, PDA is a very fragile way of being in the world. And as much as we might be assertive and say no and don't tell me what to do, we are so fragile inside and so incredibly anxious. I had to reframe the way that I to my children. I had to change my perspective or the way I understood the reasons behind their behaviour. And this meant a complete paradigm shift in the way we did family, or the way I parented, the way that my husband and I connected, the way that I engaged with my children. So for me, it was incredibly painful to let go of control as a PDAer. But miraculously, over time, it actually provided me so much relief, incredible relief, to not be controlling of everything that happened all of the time. When my children found it difficult to get out of bed and go to school, as difficult as it was for me, it was also a relief to say, you know what? If you need a rest, sure, have one. Stay home today and rest. And it was shocking for them. It was shocking. They weren't used to it. And so what I often tell families is that when we stop implementing so much control with our children, they will be confused by that, and they may even increase those behaviours that, you know, cause a lot of tension in our family. And then the difficulty for us is to not then get back in there with double the amount of control. So it's a process of constantly being conscious of what we're thinking and saying and doing. And it's like learning a completely different way of being to begin with. But over time, we get better at it, and we get better. It helped me to journal. It helped me to have a professional. And you don't have to have a professional. You can have a friend or a family member. You can write about it. But it helped me to offload to somebody else and talk about how frustrating it was to learn this new way of parenting. I guess the other thing was, you know, for many families, particularly with children with a PDA profile, is that we really start to see the animal nature in human beings when we start to parent our children differently and do life differently. Many of the people who love us tend to turn on us. And sometimes that's because inflexibility, PDA, control, autism, whatever is going on, is often genetic. So it's not always about conventional parenting and conditioning. Sometimes it's because we grew up in homes where there was a lot of control exercised as well. So people can turn on us, and that, you know, it's like being in a pressure cooker and just waiting to explode. And I want to say this, it's okay to explode. In fact, it's important to explode every now and then, but to do it somewhere safe and somewhere private. And this is why it's also so important for us to be actively designing a life for ourselves that allows for incredible flexibility, allows us to offload and explode and to engage with things that make us feel good and to have plenty of rest. I want to talk about the amazing things that come from parenting from a space of flexibility. Again, the relief of not having to control everything all the time. Also, the relief of, you know, sometimes I have a child who will say in public, "Mum, I just farted," or "Mum, I'm holding in a fart right now." And for a long time, oh my goodness, I would be absolutely humiliated and be telling her to be quiet. Oh my God, we don't say that in public. When you have that happen all of the time, you become unembarrassable. You become so prepared for anything that nothing really affects you anymore. So you're actually building resilience having children who experience incredible inflexibility. It meant that I didn't care so much what other people think anymore. It meant that as my relationship with my children improved, my relationship with myself improved. I started to like myself more. And I started to actually be able to say, hey, I'm an okay parent. I'm actually doing okay now, rather than always being really down on myself and thinking I'm failing my children. The other thing was my heart space began to unlock and open up. My children paved the way for my healing journey. So I was able to start asking really important questions about life and people and why. Why do we do this? Why is it so important that we do this? Is this about conformity? Is this about, creativity? Why is it so important? Is it so important? And one of the most common questions I ask myself in those moments where I have that innate need to control is, how important is this? How important is it? If my child gets out of bed 25 times after I put her down to sleep at night and I'm watching TV and she consistently gets out of bed and says, I need to go to the toilet, I need a drink, I want to tell you a story about something that happened today, I learnt to just be okay with that, to engage with that. Okay, no problem. Grab a drink, go back to bed. Okay, mate, no problem. Yep, go to the loo, head back to bed. Okay, tell me the story about today. Wow, really? Because the reason our children are doing that is to gain a sense of security, is to allay their fears and their anxieties and their insecurities. And it helps us to create a space of safety for them. So the reason they come out is because they might be feeling anxious, they might be feeling frightened, they might be worrying about, something that's going to happen tomorrow. And every time we acknowledge their presence and reinforce that connection with them, over time, they will feel more relaxed, more in control of themselves, and you'll see them less. I promise you, it might take months, it might take a couple of years. It depends where we're at with our children and their anxiety, but it will calm down when we actually engage with them rather than getting cross with them and saying, for God's sake, stay in bed. And I know it's difficult not to do that. And, nobody's perfect. We're going to do that because this takes so much practice. But the more we do that, we actually feed into their anxiety, we feed into our anxiety, we feed that tension, and we don't have to do it that way. I started to feel that my experience of the world had been really lacking because I'd been following what everybody else does. I'd been relying on the media and other people for their ideas around how I should parent and how we should be as a family. I was relying on what everybody else was doing in order to have permission to live a life for myself. And I look at that now and I think how painful that was. Now we have this fantastic life that's so unconventional but so joyous and so freeing. And it's okay to do things differently. It's important. The first thing about families who are neurodivergent being in pain is often that they're still trying to live a life that is not aligned with being neurodivergent. And it's okay for us to do things differently. In fact, it's absolutely crucial for us to, because we're paving the way for society to just get it and get over it. My experience of the world through flexible parenting has completely changed. I see my children so differently. I see human beings very differently. I feel so much calmer now and relaxed. And, you know, when we parent in this way, respectfully and gently and consciously, we're actually modeling to our children all of the things that we're trying to instill in them by being controlling, and it just doesn't happen. We cannot teach children about boundaries when we don't hear them when they say no. So when my child says no, I ask myself, how important is this? And then I hear their no. I hear their no. And that will take practice. But when we hear our children when they say no, what we teach them is that they are important, that they are valid, that they are allowed to say no, that they are entitled to having rights over themselves and their bodies and the way they live their lives. Parenting the way I do has also shown me a lot about how as a society we have such very little respect for children, how we treat children like animals. You know, we just have them, but they have very little rights. They have so many expectations put on them. And most of the expectations we have of children are things that we don't even live out as adults. So we have this society where there isn't a hell of a lot of modelling to our children of the very same values and qualities that we want them to have. And there's nothing that brings me more joy than watching my children being in the moment, in their full expression, playing and laughing and asking questions about difficult things and telling me stories. And, you know, I forever regret that my two eldest children missed out on that with me when they were little. They missed out on that because I was so much about controlling them and discipline, and it didn't work. It didn't work out. It disconnected us. It meant that they didn't trust me. It meant that there was no safety in their connection with me. They wouldn't tell me important things because I would overreact. So, you know, the way that I parent my children really works for us as a family, and teaches boundaries, teaching our children about boundaries by respecting theirs. And this doesn't mean that we're parenting from a space of being permissive. We're not just letting our children do whatever they want. And there's so much fear around that, as though our children are going to take over the world and everybody's going to die or something. You know, it's not about permissive parenting. It's about respecting our children as human beings who actually didn't ask to be born. So I think that, you know, I hear people when they say, how do we parent children who are incredibly inflexible when we are too? And I hear you. I hear you. It is a lifelong practice, but I promise you it is the most rewarding practice that you will ever engage in. And it is so worth it. So that's the answer to that question. I hope you all have an incredible day.